Hey everyone, welcome back to Note Lab Mode. We're doing a deep dive today into The Anxious Generation. It's by Jonathan Haidt, and it's all about the mental health challenges that Gen Z is facing. And I'm really excited to dive into all this with our expert today. But first, got to give a quick shout out to our sponsor for this deep dive. That's cloutfit.ai. So that's spelled CLOUTFIT.ai. And if you're listening, and you're in the fashion business, well, you already know how important it is to keep your users engaged, right? And to keep that revenue coming in. And that's where CloudFit.ai comes in. They use AI, cutting-edge AI solutions to help you do just that. So check them out. All right, back to our deep dive for today. So just imagine, a world where childhood is totally different. You know, kids grow up pretty much entirely online these days, so their social lives, their development, it's all shaped by screens instead of like real-world interactions, you know what I mean? It's kind of like Kol Mia, like raising kids on Mars. Isn't Kol Mia? So to help us really understand all this, I've got an expert in child development and psychology joining me today.
It is a great analogy that Mars childhood idea, parents today, they're facing all these challenges that, well, they just never really anticipated.
Exactly. So let's unpack this a little bit, this idea of a great rewiring. Um, Haight talks about that, and it really is like this perfect storm. You know, you've got this increased parental fear, overprotection of kids, combined with, well, the explosion of smartphones, right? So you put those two things together, and it creates this generation of kids that are navigating childhood in a way we've just never seen before.
And it happened so fast. You know, back in the 90s, the 1990s, things started to change. We saw this decline in what we call free play. That's the kind of unstructured time that kids used to have to just roam around and explore on their own. But then along came what Haidt calls phone-based childhood. Think about it. We had all this media sensationalism around child safety, the breakdown of trust between adults. I mean, it all kind of contributed to this. Parents just keeping their kids closer and closer.
Like parents are looking at this generation, and they're thinking, wait a minute, these aren't the kids we used to be, so how are we supposed to guide them through all of this?
And that's exactly the challenge, because what's happening is that these trends,
You know, the overprotection and the phone use.
right, they're acting as what we call experience blockers. What that means is they're preventing kids from having those really important real-world challenges and those social interactions that are so crucial for development.
Which makes me wonder, why is human childhood so long compared to other species? We're not just, popping out fully formed adults ready to go.
Yeah, you're right. And a big part of that reason is because we have this incredibly complex social world as humans. So we need time. We need time to learn the ropes and play. Play is essentially how nature trains us.
I like that.
Think about all the skills that kids pick up through play, how to negotiate, cooperate, read social cues, even how to regulate their emotions and assess risk.
It's like a crash course in being human,
Uh-huh.
but a lot more fun than sitting in a classroom.
Exactly. But when you replace that with a phone-based childhood, well, you're swapping out that rich, messy, real-world experience for something that's a lot flatter and less dynamic.
It's like that experiment with the baby geese. You know how they imprinted on Conrad Loenda's boots? Because that was the first thing they saw. They were supposed to attach to their mother goose, but they got the wrong input at that crucial time.
That's a great analogy. Our brains are wired to learn from our environments, especially during those early years. So if the environment is primarily digital, that's what our brains adapt to.
So we have these brains that are wired for exploration, excitement. Haidt calls that discover mode. But we're also wired for threat detection and protection. So that's defend mode.
Right. And it's so fascinating to see how those modes play out in Gen Z. Think about college campuses. Millennials arrived in discover mode, eager for all those new experiences. But Gen Z, they arrive much more guarded and more anxious.
Makes sense if you think about it. If you've spent your formative years being told that the world is this scary place and you always need to be, vigilant online, then you're going to approach everything with more caution.
Exactly. It's like they're missing out on that period of carefree exploration that helps to build confidence and resilience. It's like they haven't had a chance to fully embrace that ever mode.
The difference between a puppy and a well, maybe like a really cautious kitten. Puppies are all crazy energy, always getting into things. It's how they learn. They're not afraid to try or to fail and to try again. But kittens are more observant.
That's a great way to put it. It highlights a really crucial point. When we overprotect kids, when we try to shield them from every risk and every negative emotion, we might actually be making them more fragile in the long run. They don't get to practice bouncing back from setbacks.
So they haven't had the chance to develop those coping mechanisms. It's like a muscle. You have to exercise it. If you never lift anything heavy, your muscles atrophy.
Exactly. The same thing happens with resilience.
So we're starting to see now how this great rewiring sets the stage for some of these mental health challenges that Gen Z is facing. But puberty, that's obviously another huge turning point, right? So when kids are supposed to be transitioning to adulthood.
And historically, that transition was marked by these rites of passage. Think about those rituals that push kids outside of their comfort zones, challenge them physically and mentally. They're rituals that give them a sense of accomplishment and belonging within their community.
Right, like those coming-of-age ceremonies in different cultures.
Exactly. They might look different in every society, but they all serve that same purpose, to prepare adolescents for the responsibilities and the expectations of adulthood.
But in our society today, we don't really have those clear-cut milestones, do we? Especially when it comes to the internet. It's like, when do kids actually get treated like they can handle more freedom and responsibility online? It's all so blurry.
And that lack of clarity is a problem. Haidt argues that we need to establish clear age transitions for internet access, similar to driving or voting. He suggests a model with increasing independence at 13 and then again at 16, with the understanding that full internet adulthood doesn't happen until 18.
Oh, so like a digital driver's license. You get more privileges as you demonstrate maturity and responsibility.
It's a good way to think about it. It's about scaffolding their experience, gradually increasing their autonomy.
Okay, so we've got this great rewiring, a lack of clear transitions to adulthood. And then on top of all that, we add social media. And things get really intense, especially for girls. The statistics on mental health problems are pretty alarming.
Yeah. And it's not just the quantity of time that kids are spending online, but it's the quality of those interactions and the content that they're exposed to. Haidt outlines 4 foundational crimes of these phone-based childhoods that really drive this point home. So those 4 things are social deprivation, sleep deprivation, attention fragmentation, and addiction.
Okay, wow, that's a lot. But I get the sleep deprivation part. I mean, teenagers, they're already like notorious for being night owls, right? So if you give them a screen, this beaming blue light into their eyes before bed, I mean, that's just, it's a recipe for disaster.
Right. But it's more than just being tired. Chronic sleep deprivation, it affects everything. Their mood, their concentration, their impulse control. It's like trying to function with a brain that's running on fumes.
And, I've definitely noticed that my own attention span just kind of like vanishes when I spend too much time scrolling. But for kids who've grown up with this constant like barrage of digital stimulation, I mean, how does that play out for them?
It's almost like the brains are being trained to just jump from one thing to the next without ever really focusing. So that fragmentation makes it really hard to engage in deep thinking, to stick with those challenging tasks, even to just have a meaningful conversation where you're really present.
And then there's the addiction piece. And I think we all feel that pull sometimes, right? Like just one more scroll, one more video, one more notification.
Exactly. And those social media apps, they're designed to exploit that vulnerability. They use these little dopamine hits to keep us coming back for more, even when we know it's not good for us.
Like those slot machines in Vegas, just unpredictable enough to keep you hooked.
Yes.
But you rarely walk away a winner.
Perfect analogy. And when you think about how much our culture emphasizes appearance, social status, having that perfect life, social media just amplifies all of that. And that's why Girls in particular are so vulnerable.
Yeah, it's like this constant stream
Mm-hmm.
of curated perfection that's just impossible to live up to. So no wonder anxiety and depression are on the rise.
Right. And in general, girls are more attuned to social cues. They're more sensitive to those comparisons. They're wired to care about relationships and connection. So they're more likely to get caught up in all that social drama, the pressure to conform, the fear of missing out.
Haidt tells this story about a girl named Alexis, and it really brings this home. So she was this happy kid who loved to play outside, but then she got on Instagram, and everything changed. She started comparing herself to others, feeling inadequate. And all that negativity, it just wore her down.
It's heartbreaking, and it really highlights those real-world consequences of this digital pressure cooker. And while girls might be more visibly affected, boys are struggling too, just in different ways.
Right, they're not immune to anxiety and depression, but it seems like they're dealing with a whole other set of pressures.
Exactly. Boys are more likely to withdraw from real-world activities, to spend hours gaming. And they struggle with motivation and a sense of purpose. We're seeing this rise in what's been called failure to launch. These are young men who just can't seem to find their footing in adulthood.
So it's not just about mental health, is it? It's about this lack of engagement with life, this sense of emptiness.
Het uses the term spiritual degradation to describe this, which I know that might sound a little heavy, but I think it captures something important. We're losing those connections to something larger than ourselves, those experiences that give life meaning and purpose.
Yeah, it's like we're all just floating around in this digital ether, disconnected from each other and from the things that really matter.
And that's where things like mindfulness, spending time in nature, finding those experiences that connect us to something sacred, those become so important.
So, is there any hope? Can we actually turn this ship around? Or are we all doomed to succumb to the anxiety and enemy of the digital age?
Well, Haidt is actually quite optimistic. He lays out this roadmap for collective action, these steps that governments, companies, schools, and parents can take to restore a healthier balance.
Okay, I'm all ears. Let's talk solutions. What needs to happen at the government level?
Well, for starters, we need stronger regulations to protect kids online. Think about age verification to prevent kids from accessing platforms that are harmful to their development.
So it's like how we have age limits for alcohol and tobacco. We recognize that kids aren't equipped to handle those things, so we have laws in place to protect them.
Exactly. And the same principle applies to the digital world. Kids' brains are still developing. Their impulse control is still immature. They need safeguards in place.
So no more 10-year-olds with free reign on Instagram.
Ideally, no. Haidt suggests raising the age of internet adulthood back to 16 and requiring companies to actually enforce those age restrictions.
That makes sense. But what about all the parents out there who are understandably terrified to let their kids have any unsupervised freedom in the real world?
That's where governments can play a role too. We need to reform those vague neglect laws that criminalize things like letting kids play outside unsupervised or walk to school alone.
Because right now, it feels like parents are constantly being told that they have to be hypervigilant, that any moment of inattention could lead to disaster.
And that fear just feeds into the overprotection cycle, which ultimately makes kids less safe because they're not developing the skills and confidence that they need to navigate the world independently.
So governments can step up and create policies that actually support parents in giving their kids more freedom, more real-world experiences. It's almost like a culture shift away from fear.
Exactly. It's about shifting toward a more balanced approach to risk and responsibility.
Okay, so that's the government's role. But what about the tech companies themselves? I mean, they're the ones designing these addictive platforms in the first place. Can we really expect them to change their ways?
Well, Haidt acknowledges that it's a tough sell. because their business model is built on engagement, on keeping us glued to our screens. But there are things that they could do to mitigate the harm.
Like what? Are we talking about like a nicotine patch for social media?
Maybe not that drastic, but think about things like limiting notifications, disabling those autoplay features, making it easier for users to set time limits and track their usage.
So it's like giving people more control over their own digital diets, helping them make more conscious choices.
Exactly. And it's not just about individual responsibility. Tech companies have a moral obligation to design their platforms in a way that prioritizes well-being over profit.
Okay, so we've got the government setting some guardrails and the tech companies designing more ethically, but what about schools? I mean, they're on the front lines of this mental health crisis.
Absolutely. And Hott has some pretty radical ideas for how schools can create environments that counter these negative trends. He's a big proponent of phone-free schools, for example.
Like completely phone-free, I can already hear the protests from parents and kids.
I know, it sounds extreme, but think about the benefits. More face-to-face interaction, less distraction, a chance for kids to actually be present with each other.
And wouldn't that help with the social deprivation piece? If kids aren't constantly glued to their phones, they might actually, talk to each other.
Exactly. It forces them to engage with their real-world surroundings and build those social skills that are so crucial for development.
And he doesn't stop there. He also talks about making schools more playful, which sounds a lot more fun than all those standardized tests.
Right. He advocates for things like longer recess periods, more unstructured playtime, even creating designated adventure playgrounds where kids can take risks and explore.
Wait, adventure playgrounds, what does that even look like?
Think loose parts, natural elements, even a bit of controlled chaos. The idea is to give kids a space where they can challenge themselves physically, test their limits, and build resilience.
It sounds like a dream come true for any kid who's ever been told to be careful one too many times.
Exactly. And it's not just about letting kids run wild. It's about providing them with opportunities to practice problem solving, cooperation, risk assessment, all those essential life skills that are so often missing in our overprotected, sanitized world.
So we've got phone-free schools, playful schools, and governments that are actually supporting parents in letting their kids have more independence. That sounds like a pretty good start.
It is, but ultimately it all comes down to the parents, right? They're the ones who set the tone, who create the home environment, who model those healthy habits.
Okay, so parents are the gatekeepers, but what can they do? I mean, there's so much pressure to give in, to let kids have those devices, to conform to the social norms. It's like this constant battle, between wanting to protect your kids, but also wanting them to, thrive in this digital world.
It is. It's a balancing act. But Het has some really practical advice. He emphasizes delaying smartphone use for as long as possible, setting clear limits on screen time, and creating device-free zones in the home.
So like no phones at the dinner table, no screens in the bedroom, that kind of stuff.
Exactly. It's about reclaiming those spaces for connection, for conversation, for those real-world experiences. And it's not just about saying no to screens all the time. Parents need to model healthy tech use themselves, show their kids that there's a time and a place for devices, and that real life happens offline.
So it's like teaching them to be mindful, digital citizens, not just passive consumers.
Exactly. And one of the most powerful things that parents can do is to encourage their kids to get involved in activities that foster that real-world connection and purpose. So think about things like sports, clubs, volunteering, even just hanging out with friends in person.
Right, giving them those alternatives to the digital world, opportunities to experience that sense of belonging and accomplishment that's so hard to find online.
And don't underestimate the power of nature. Haidt talks about how those awe-inspiring experiences in nature can help to counter the anxiety and self-focus that are so prevalent in our tech-saturated world.
So get those kids outside. Let them climb trees, get dirty, experience the wonder of the natural world. It's like a digital detox for the soul.
I love that. And it's not just about kids either. We all need those moments of disconnection, those opportunities to reconnect with ourselves and with something larger than ourselves.
Yeah. It's like hitting the reset button on our brains, reminding ourselves that there's more to life than this constant stream of digital stimulation.
Precisely. And when we model that for our kids, when we show them that we value those real world experiences, we're giving them a powerful message about what truly matters.
So, what does this all mean? What's the takeaway for our listeners today?
Well, I think the key message is that we have a choice. We don't have to passively accept the anxiety and the enemy of the digital age. We can take action individually and collectively to reclaim a healthier, more balanced way of life.
We can bring childhood back down to earth, so to speak.
Exactly. And it starts with awareness. Once we understand the forces that are shaping our kids' development, once we recognize the potential harms of a phone-based childhood, we can start making different choices.
We can set boundaries, prioritize real-world experiences, model healthy habits, advocate for policies that protect kids online, and create environments that support their well-being.
And we can do it together. This isn't about blaming parents or demonizing technology. It's about recognizing that we're all in this together and we need to find a way forward that honors the needs of both children and adults in this rapidly changing world.
So here's our final thought for you to consider. What one small step can you take today to reduce your own screen time or encourage more real-world experiences for yourself or a young person in your life? And that's a wrap for our deep dive into the anxious generation. If you found this deep dive useful, please share it with a friend. And don't forget to subscribe to NoteLab Mode for more deep dives on topics that matter. Until next time, stay curious.